Welcome back, everyone, to another Palydyn Presents Top 10 list. I am, of course, Palydyn, and this week I am counting down the top 10 games for the Atari 2600. Hey, please smash that like button and subscribe to the channel to be alerted to when I drop another top 10 gaming list. Okay, we all set? Then let's take a look at the top 10 games for the Atari 2600.
Number 10, Pole Position.
Pole Position was originally released by Namco for arcades in Japan in 1982, but was later ported to the Atari 2600 console in 1983 for the North American market. In the game, the player takes the wheel of a Formula One race car where they compete in a time trial to qualify for an F1 race held at the Fuji racetrack. This was the first racing game to feature a track based on a real racing circuit. Pole Position was also one of the first games to feature in-game product advertising in the form of billboards. In the Atari version, players can see billboards for ads such as 7-Eleven, Dentine, Stampede, and Dig Dug. With its strong sales and fun gameplay, Pole Position was hailed by many as not just one of the best Atari 2600 games, but as one of the best racing games of all time. Pole Position helped to usher in a new era of console racing games and is well deserving of a spot in my top 10.
Number 9, Stampede.
Landing at the number 9 spot on my list is Stampede, written for the Atari 2600 by Bob Whitehead and published by Activision in 1981 for the use on the Atari 2600. In the game, players are tasked with rounding up cattle by lassoing them while not allowing them to pass by you. The cattle all run in the same direction as the player, and initially the game allowed for 2 cattle to escape, with the game ending if a third one gets past the player. And watch out for the Black Angus, a non-moving, stubborn calf that the player needs to decide when to deal with. For every 1,000 points the player scores, they also earn a free pass. When the player reaches 5,000 points, the game essentially resets and the gameplay pattern is repeated. The main reason Stampede makes my top 10 is its uniqueness. It was a different sort of game with an original idea. No shooting or racing, but roping cattle. Yeehaw, partner!
Number 8, River Raid.
Designed and programmed by Carol Shaw, River Raid let players fly fighter jets behind enemy lines on the ominous-sounding River of No Return. Destroy enemy tankers, helicopters, jets, etc. to accumulate points while flying over fuel depots to keep your jet in the air. Players could only maneuver their planes left and right, as well as accelerate and decelerate. Various checkpoints exist throughout the game in the form of bridges, which the player must blow up to activate. If the player crashes, they will respawn at the last bridge they destroyed. River Raid sold over 1 million copies on the Atari 2600 after its release in 1982, and was later ported to the Atari 5200, ColecoVision, and Intellivision, as well as PCs. The game had a unique design, and many players found the gameplay refreshing and fun compared to other games out at the time. Many considered River Raid the best Atari 2600 game of 1982, and it makes my list of one of the best games ever for the system.
Number 7, Space Invaders.
In my opinion, you cannot have a top 10 of Atari 2600 games without including this one. Coming in at lucky number 7 is Space Invaders, one of the most iconic games of all time, not just for the Atari 2600. Space Invaders originally debuted in Japanese arcades in 1978, and it wasn't long before it became a smash hit. Taito then licensed it out to Midway 2 years later, and the game launched on the Atari 2600 in North America. The game was the first official licensing of an arcade game for consoles when it hit the 2600, and man, did it not disappoint. Space Invaders sold over 2 million units by the end of its first year, and over 5 million units by the end of 1982. The game was so popular it helped to quadruple the sales of the Atari 2600 system. Space Invaders not only helped to make the Atari 2600 a success, but it is recognized as one of the greatest as well as influential games of all time. Just on the impact alone it had on the sales of the Atari 2600 is reason enough to have it in my top 10.
Number 6, Jungle Hunt.
Originally titled Jungle King, developer Taito was forced to change the name to Jungle Hunt, as well as the look of the main character, from a loincloth-wearing dude to an explorer wearing a safari outfit and pith helmet. Why all the changes, you ask? Because the estate of Edgar Rice Burroughs felt the game was too modeled after its famous Tarzan character. After all the legal dust settled, the resulting game changes included was a hit. Players swing across jungle vines, navigate crocodile-infested rivers, dodging falling boulders, and evading cannibals to rescue the woman you love. The game was ported over to the Atari 2600 in 1983 and quickly became Taito's biggest hit since Space Invaders, according to some at the time. For anyone collecting games on the 2600, Jungle Hunt is a definite must-have for your collection and lands at number 6 on my list.
Number 5, Combat.
If you were to pick a poster child for the Atari 2600, then my number 5 game may fit the bill. Combat was one of the 9 launch titles for the console when it came out in 1977, and was based on earlier black and white arcade versions also made by Atari, Tank in 1974 and Jet Fighter in 1975. Combat's color graphics and 27 game modes made it a hit among players. The game featured scenarios involving tanks, biplanes, and jet fighters. Bouncing munitions, invisibility, the game featured all kinds of combat mayhem. By 1982, Combat had sold over 1 million copies and was considered a mainstay by fans of the Atari 2600. Due to its popularity, a sequel to Combat was planned for 1984, but the video game crash of 1983 derailed those plans until ultimately the sequel was canceled. Combat has a lasting legacy to those who collect for the 2600, having been one of the launch titles in '77, and if we're being honest, the game was fun in a simplistic sort of way as well.
Number 4, Adventure.
For all of you out there who read or watched Ready Player One, this game will be very familiar to you. That's right, it's none other than Adventure, which was released for the Atari 2600 in 1980. In the game, you're tasked with finding the enchanted chalice and returning it to the Golden Castle. Explore 30 rooms while keeping an eye out for 3 dragons that roam the world. There's also a pesky bat you have to deal with as well. There are also several objects scattered across the world to help you in your quest, such as keys, magnets, a magic bridge, and of course, a sword. Warren Robinett spent a year designing and coding the game, but Atari had a policy at the time that denied giving public credit to programmers. So what was Robinett's solution? He programmed in a secret room within the game that players only found after the game had shipped. This helped to pioneer the Easter egg concept for game design, which continues to this day. Adventure eventually went on to sell over 1 million copies, but it's the game's historical significance that lands it at the number 4 spot on my list.
Number 3, Demon Attack.
And the number 3 spot on the list is the fixed shooter classic Demon Attack, released for the Atari 2600 in 1982 and later ported to other game consoles and PCs. The game takes place on the ice planet Krybor, where players find themselves marooned and fighting for their lives against waves of demons that swoop down from above. The game was originally programmed to end after the 84th wave because the game's designer Rob Fulop didn't expect anyone to get that far. 2 days after the game released, news came out that someone had already beaten it. This eventually led Fulop going back and changing a line of code, making it so the game would never end, without becoming more difficult at the same time. At the end of its run on the 2600, Demon Attack had sold just over 2 million copies. With its fun gameplay and solid graphics for the time, Demon Attack became a must-have for Atari owners.
Number 2, Frogger.
Originally developed for the arcade by Konami and manufactured by Sega in 1981, Frogger was eventually licensed to Parker Brothers for cartridge versions of the game for consoles and home PCs. In 1982, the game was ported to the Atari 2600, which ended up earning Parker Brothers $40 million in orders for the console. By the end of 1982, Frogger had sold over 4 million cartridges on the 2600, raking in over $80 million in revenue, which in today's numbers would be just over $200 million. Not too shabby. So Frogger sold well on the 2600, but did that make it a fun game? According to many players and reviewers at the time, the Atari 2600 version of the arcade game was one of the best arcade-to-console translations ever done. In other words, why spend all those quarters playing the arcade version when you can buy the Atari version once and play at home to your heart's content? Many consider the Atari version just as good as the arcade, and the sales supported this. Frogger is undoubtedly one of those games that has earned its spot as one of the greatest video games ever made, and the Atari 2600 version helped to prove that. Before I unveil my pick for the best game on the Atari 2600, here are some of the games that just missed making the list.
Number 1, Pitfall.
And finally, we come to Pitfall, my pick as the best game on the Atari 2600. Not only is it the best game for the 2600, because of its historical impact and importance in game design and development, I consider Pitfall one of the greatest video games of all time, period. Follow Pitfall Harry as he navigates his way across 255 connected screens of jungle in a quest to gather 32 treasures in the span of 20 minutes. Along the way, Harry will have to deal with pits, snakes, quicksand, logs, scorpions, fire, and crocodiles. Sounds like fun, right? Well, millions of players across the world thought so at the time, selling over 4 million copies on the 2600 version alone. At one point, Pitfall was the #1 game on the Billboard charts for 64 weeks in a row. Its side-scrolling platform style would go on to become a mainstay in later 8-bit and 16-bit systems, as well as spawn many sequels on various consoles in the years to come. If you were to ask me which one game to pick to represent the Atari 2600, Pitfall is my choice. And that's another top 10 list in the books. What did you think of the list? What games would you have included? Which games would not have made your list? Let me know in the comments below. I hope you all have a great week, and I'll see you again next time for another Palydyn Presents Top 10 list. See you soon!